beautiful day.
I think it's such a beautiful day. We're so fortunate that have lived in Beverly Hills so long. Don't you feel that way?
I feel that way definitely, Mom.
You've been in Beverly Hills all of your life.
That's right.
I've lived here practically all of my life. I've lived here over 75 years.
Mom, it's more
and I've
than
seen
that.
the changes. And they've been absolutely unbelievable. And I hope it never changes. I hope it stays the way it is. I came here because my dad was a contractor and builder, and he built the Stanley Anderson block in Beverly Hills and the A.J. Baudet block, and he did work for Hearst. And Hearst, to remember, was his girlfriend lived up on Lexington, and they revised the entire home for her. And anyway, Dad fell in love with Beverly Hills. That's why we came here. In fact, you wouldn't know this, but saw Beverly Hills long before Beverly Hills was Beverly Hills, because Dad used to come out here to see the work and see the jobs, and we'd take a Sunday afternoon ride out here. And we became acquainted with the Beverly Hills Theater, which was a motion picture house, and they had an organist there. Dad and Mother bought a home bought a lot, and only paid $17,000 for it at the corner of Lexington and Rexford.
Edward G. Robinson lived right next door.
And it was the one band leader who invited us to his parties when...
Oh, who lived next door here? Yes, that was Xavier Kuga.
Who?
Xavier
Kuga, that's right. And Hetty Lamar lived next door.
Yeah.
There was nothing else to buy in Beverly Hills. In fact, we couldn't buy a thing. We couldn't buy a pair of gloves. We couldn't buy a pair of hose. We couldn't buy a handkerchief. We had to go to Hollywood or Los Angeles. And we did. The only store that we really, really enjoyed, and that was a hardware store. We had a great hardware store. But they were wonderful young men and graduated from Beverly Hills High School. What year did you graduate?
1948.
1948, I didn't remember.
Well, Mom, I think it would be kind of interesting to talk about the fact that you came to Beverly Hills in April of 1924 and moved into that house that you were describing up at the corner of Lexington and Rexford.
Yeah.
And the reason that your dad became interested in Beverly Hills was because he came out and he was the contractor, the general contractor on the first Beverly Hills City Hall. He also was the general contractor when Horace Mann School was built. He came here in 1924 and settled up there with your mother, my grandmother, and there was a stream that ran right through the middle of your property, was there not? It came right down from Coldwater Canyon. You used to drive around Beverly Hills in your roadster, and you would go out on a Saturday afternoon and you'd drive all over the city and not see one other car on the road. In addition to our family having a history up at Lexington and Rexford, the house where we are right now here at 721 North Rexford Drive came into our family when my paternal grandfather's family settled here. My dad's family settled here also in 1924, and they lived here until 1945 when my grandmother sold this property to my mother and dad.
To us.
Yes, my mother and to you and Dad, and that was in August of 1945 on VJ Day that we moved into this house.
That's right.
And that was almost 47 years ago, 57 years ago.
54 years ago.
57.
Well, Loretta Young used to come over to our house a great deal with her sister, and she was so beautiful. But she wasn't, she didn't speak very often, but she came with her family and her sisters, and a friend of mine brought her over. That's how that happened, who was associated with motion pictures, and I don't think you met him there. But anyway, she was just charming, couldn't be any nicer. And Lawrence Tibbett, as I said, lived across the street from us up here, and he was a delightful man.
Stella Orr and Stella Francis. They formed a partnership and had the stationery store.
Stationery store.
It was on, I believe, North Rodeo Drive at the time. Oh, Mom, don't you remember Stella Francis and Stella Orr both used to play bridge with your mother?
I know.
They played every Saturday night. They played bridge together. They always, and my grandmother, your mother, would stay home and kind of babysit for my brother and I while you and Pop were out partying. Huh? For my brother and me, yes, I'm pregnant. Anyway,
we had wonderful places to go here. We had Armstrong Schroeder's restaurant, which was located on Wilshire Boulevard. We had the Tropics, which was really a great.
that was Shuggy's Tropics. That was the predecessor to the Luau.
Yes.
It was Harry Sugarman that owned it. Mama Weiss's Hungarian Casarda was his next door neighbor. And after you and Pop were married, you lived in an apartment on Reeves Drive,
I
and
remember.
that's where you brought me home from the hospital to live at 256 South Reeves Drive. And by the time I was 9 months old, we had moved into 224 South Lapeer Drive, and it was there where I lived when we went to Horseman. I went to Horseman School for the first, second, third, in the middle of the fourth grade. We moved from Lapeer Drive over to 208 McCarty, and we lived there all during World War II from January of 1940 until August of 1945, when we all moved into this house up here.
Also, you had to turn off of Olympic to get onto Pruce Road. And Olympic was only paved as far as Robertson, but it was called Pruce Road.
And when we lived on McCarty Drive, when we would go out to plant a bush or a tree, we'd dig down through about 1.5 feet of soil, and then we'd have to get a pick out and pick through the asphalt of the racetrack, because our house was built right on top of the site of the racetrack. Mentioned earlier, this house here was first occupied prior to 1924. Is it not true that it used to be on the lot across the alley and it was moved over here? That's very interesting. I don't know how they did it.
So it was. They moved it from Crescent to Rexford.
Right.
And that's when the Nasons purchased it.
In 1924, right. And
Sounds
you remember
like that.
Anderson's restaurant there at the corner of, was it at the corner of Beverly Drive and Wilshire, or was it at Reeves and Wilshire? Where we used to go down and have chicken dinners on Sunday. And that was before World War II. And then during the war, we had the ranch house there at the corner of Roxbury and Dayton Way. And we would go there and we could get twin hamburgers for 25 cents. Or else we'd go over to Simon's Drive-In, which was 1 block over. All the people from Beverly Hills used to hang out at Simon's. There was one particular waitress there that everybody really liked. I think her name was Martha. Really a very good-looking girl. We used to enjoy Armstrong Schroeder's. They served wonderful breakfast and great food. Herbie was in the Beverly Hills Gun Club when my dad was the president of it. That was when they used to go duck hunting. Herbie was one of them, and John Deaton, who owned Deaton Motors down on Olympic Boulevard, and Miles Andrews, who was the general manager of Sloan's. But I think kind of interest is the fact that your dad just missed out on being one of the charter members of the Beverly Hills Rotary Club that was organized in December of 1924. I think he joined about January of 1925, and he brought Pop in when Pop was 23 years old in 1928.
Your father?
My father, yes. And then my father brought me in 1954 when I was 23 years old.
You were president of Rotary.
I was president in 1985-86, and Pop was president in 1946-47.
Oh, but I remember.
Well, you remember Chief Anderson.
Chief ruled Beverly Hills.
You remember Charlie Blair, too.
Yes.
He preceded Chief Anderson. He goes way back. And Chief Canfield, who was the head of the fire department, he was the fire chief. And I remember my dad taking us over there and going through the fire department and watching the firemen slide down the pole And I also remember going over to the Beverly Hills Waterworks when we were in school. Our whole class went over. This was over on La Cienega and Gregory Way.
This perfectly beautiful gentleman rode a white horse, had on his white habit, and with a shock of white hair. And he would ride up and down our grotto paths. And his name was Herbert Boswell.
Hubert Boswell.
Hubert Boswell. Mm-hmm.
Right.
And he was really the #1 showman because he was elegant.
My dad, your husband, was in the real estate business here in Beverly Hills with George Prindle, and he got the idea to go into the moving and storage business. So he heard about this little company that had one truck that was built in a blacksmith shop and an office that accepted telephone calls at a nearby gasoline station. And he bought a quarter interest in the company for $1,100, and he bought the second quarter interest for $400, realizing that he'd kind of been taken for the first quarter interest. And this was in 1928.
I forgot that.
An interesting story too is Pop was a fire watcher on top of our building on South Beverly Drive at 221 South Beverly Drive, which is still occupied by Beverly Hills Transfer and Storage Company. He would go to fire watchers meetings along with the air raid wardens, and one of the air raid wardens who would go to the meetings regularly with him was his very close friend Dave Hyler Sr. And one night Dave Hyler Sr. was walking home from an air raid warden's meeting with one of the producers at 20th Century Fox. He was saying how much he needed a young girl who had an English accent, who knew something about horses. And Dave Hyler suggested to him, well, you know, Frances Taylor up at the Beverly Hills Hotel, who has the art gallery up there, has a little girl, and I think she has an English accent. She might be just what you're looking for. The rest of it is history, because that young lady was Elizabeth Taylor, and the next day she went for a screen test.
Mm-hmm. Will Rogers lived here, and he lived about 4 blocks up on Lexington Road and had a beautiful estate. Tom Mix also lived in Beverly Hills on Lexington Road. Who lived on
Lawrence Tibbett.
Yes, lived on Beverly.
Dolly Green.
Oh,
And Burton Green. You knew the Greens too,
Dolly
didn't
Green.
you? Well, Dolly's dad, of course, was the founder of the city of Beverly Hills. And he founded it in 1907.
He had these 2 beautiful daughters that lived here, and they were known as the founder's daughters, really. Pardon?
That's correct. Bertie Bettingen was Burton Green Bettingen. She married Mr. Bettingen. And I can't remember. Oh, Dolly Green, I think, married Enrique Shandubi, did he not? That I would say the Beverly Theater and the Warner's Theater were 2 landmarks, and of course the Wilshire Theater. We went to a movie last week at the Music Hall on Wilshire Boulevard, Wilshire and Weatherly, and I can remember well in 1941 going there with my uncle and seeing, it was called the Elite Theater in those days, and we saw the movie Submarine D1. In 1945, my dad opened the Nason Rolap Furniture Company on South Beverly Drive in the building that we own down there, and he had the franchise for the Philco television as well as for Bendix washers and dryers, and I think we had the second TV in Beverly Hills.
I think so too.
And we had people coming over to watch TV at our house. I well remember the 1948 Michigan USC Rose Bowl game, where we had our little 7-inch TV set up in the living room, and we had 40 people in the living room watching the little 7-inch, watching the game on the little 7-inch set, and thinking how wonderful it was that they were actually able to see the game in progress. That was kind of interesting.
Yeah. And then dear Howard Amundsen. My goodness, he was our dearest friend. And he was the one that built the beautiful building at the corner of Rexford and Wilshire. And of course, one day Howard said to me, you know, Vi, he would love this. He said, you know, I have $3 million today. Well, that was a lot of money in those days, way, way back. That was about 44, 45, $3 million. Well, I saw Bob out at Santa Anita one day, and I said, how are you doing in the business? And he told me how much and all that. He said, what am I going to do with it?
They made the lovely contribution to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art
Oh, they've
and
done
to
everything.
every place in the Amundsen Theater at the Music Center downtown. Beverly Hills Transfer and Storage Company, as we mentioned earlier, started here in 1924, and I believe it is still the second oldest member of the Beverly Hills Chamber of Commerce. And we had a reputation, Beverly Hills Transfer and Storage Company had a reputation throughout the world as the movers of the stars, because so many of our clients were the motion picture personalities that everybody in the world knew by name. When Jerome Kern moved, he called my dad up to see him, and before he would even let him talk about moving, he said, "Sit down, I want to play some songs for you." So he played his music for him for the next half hour. Moved Dorothy Lamour on June 15th, 1955, and the reason I remember the date is because it was the 30th anniversary of the incorporating of our company, and we bought a brand new moving van to celebrate it, and Dorothy Lamour came out and put her lip prints on the cab of on the tractor of the van, and we shellacked over it so that it was always there.
We moved all of the stars.
Yes.
Really, truly, I mean...
You should tell about the night that Xavier Cugat had the party next door,
Oh,
following his premiere of Holiday in Mexico, when he invited you and Pop over there to...
We had two parties. And Abby Lane was there, and she was real cute running.
He invited you over so that the neighbors wouldn't complain about the noise, because his music was playing all night long. Another interesting thing, he was very close to Hosea Turby, and frequently Hosea Turby would be a house guest over there, and they would ask him to play the piano, and when he played the piano, we opened up all the windows of our house so that we could hear the music, because it was so beautiful. My dad, who went to USC, the night that he graduated, he didn't have any plans, so his roommate at the time said, "Come on, Fred, let's go up to downtown LA and let's really celebrate." So they went up to downtown Los Angeles. This was in 1927, during Prohibition, and they each bought a bottle of Dago red wine and proceeded to get very relaxed. Well, the police picked them up and took them into the police station, and my dad said, "You can't put us in jail," and they said, "Why not?" He said, "Because my dad owns the jail," which happened to be the case. His dad owned the building that the jail was in, and one way or another they talked themselves out of going to jail, and they got out at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and they took inventory, and between them they had 35 cents in change. So they said, let's hire a taxi driver to give us 35 cents worth back towards the SC campus, and we'll walk the rest of the way. Well, the taxi driver was a really good guy and took them all the way back for the 35 cents. So I have in my home a picture of my dad's roommate at college, on which he's written to my dad, "Hey Fred, where's that taxi driver? I'll get back our 35 cents. And signed Duke. My dad's roommate was John Wayne. My brother was killed in a kite skiing accident in 1968. He was competing in the International Kite Skiing Championships at the Long Beach Marine Stadium. And there were some helicopters in the area, and they caused a downdraft, and that caused him to lose his balance, and he fell a distance of 75 feet, going approximately 60 miles an hour. He was actually winning the race, but he left 3 young sons. His youngest son at the time was 18 days old. His other sons were 8 and 7, and he had gone to Beverly Hills High School, and then he went to USC, and he also was working at the time for Beverly Hills Transfer and Storage Company. And when he was at Beverly Hills High School, the day that he graduated, it was announced from the graduation platform that he was the first person in 4 years to graduate from Beverly Hills High School without ever having missed a day. The only minor bit of trivia that they left out when they made that announcement was the last person who did it before him was his older brother, myself, which is kind of an unusual record. And I think that's a great reflection on you,
Oh, thank you.
because you kept us healthy and made us go to school.
You were too-
Let that
you
be
were
a
too
lesson
good
to
for
him.
us.